I was unable to learn anything more from anyone else, but this much I learned by carrying my researches as far as possible. Having gone and made my own observations as far as Elephantine, and beyond that obtaining information from hearsay, the country is steep here. Therefore, it is necessary to attach a rope to both sides of a boat, as one does with an ox in a plough, and so proceed. But if the rope should happen to break, the boat is carried away by the force of the stream. This kind of country lasts for a 4 days' passage, and the Nile here winds are much as the meander. There are 12 schooni which it is necessary to sail through. In this manner, and after that you will come to a level plain where the Nile flows round an island. Its name is Tecumseh. Ethiopians inhabit the country immediately above Elephantine, and one half of the island, the other half is inhabited by Egyptians. Near to this island lies a vast lake on the borders of which Ethiopian nomads dwell. After sailing through this lake you will come to the channel of the Nile which flows into it. Then you will have to land and travel 40 days by the side of the river, for sharp rocks rise in the Nile, and there are many sunken ones through which it is not possible to navigate a boat. Having passed this country, sail for 12 days, and then you will arrive at a very large city called Meroe. This city is said to be the capital of the Ethiopians. The inhabitants worship no other gods than Jupiter and Bacchus, but these they honor with great magnificence. They have also an oracle of Jupiter, and they make war whenever that god bids them, but an oracle warning, and against whatever country he bids them. Sailing from this city, you will arrive at the country of the Otomoli in a space of time equal to that which you took in coming from Elephantine to the capital of the Ethiopians. Before we carry on down this path, let's first take his advice. So he says the distance from Elephantine to Meroe. Well, if we take the same distance and we travel down, and he says that's where we're gonna find these Otomali. If we take the same distance and we travel down from the Meroitic areas all the way down about 1,000 kilometers, we end up in Juba, South Sudan. These Otomali are called by the name of Asmak, which in the language of the Greek signifies those that stand at the left hand of the king. These to the number of 240,000 of the Egyptian war tribes revolted to the Ethiopians on the following occasion. In the reign of Psamtik, garrisons were stationed at Elephantine against the Ethiopians, and another at Pelusian Daphne against the Arabians and Syrians, and another at Meria against Libya. And even in my time, garrisons of the Persians are stationed in the same place as they were in the time of Psamtik, for they maintained guard at Elephantine and Daphne. Now these Egyptians, after they had been on duty 3 years, were not relieved. Therefore, having consulted together and come to a unanimous resolution, they all revolted from Psamtik and went to Ethiopia. Psamtik heard of this, pursued them, and when he overtook them, he entreated them by many arguments and adjured them not to forsake the gods of their fathers and their children and wives. These men, when they arrived in Ethiopia, offered their services to the king of the Ethiopians, who made them the following recompense. There were certain Ethiopians disaffected toward him. These he bade them expel and take possession of their land. By the settlement of these men among the Ethiopians became more civilized and learned the manners of the Egyptians. From what I gather from this phrasing and this entire passage, we can tell that the Otomali seem to have gone against the Meroitic king, and then the people who went against the pharaohs in Egypt went and worked for the Ethiopian king. And the Ethiopian king, in order to show their loyalty, said, "Go take over the land of the Otomali." That's what I gather from what they're saying. Or they might be saying, this is the second one, that the Otomali are these Egyptians who are stationed further south from Meroe. Either way, if this is the case, it's a very interesting passage. But that's just for now. There's still something that we need to read about Asia and Arabia. And this is very important because it comes into everything I've been saying about the Sabaean kingdom and everything like that. Now, for a voyage and land journey of 4 months, the Nile is known in addition to the part of the stream that is in Egypt. For upon computation, so many months are known to be spent by a person who travels from Elephantine to the Otomali. This river flows from the west and the setting of the sun, but beyond this no one is able to speak with certainty, for the rest of the country is desert by reason of excessive heat. The information shared with us here about these Egyptians who took hold or replaced the people who lived in that region of Ethiopia under the command of the Ethiopians, and what would happen after this is very valuable information, and it comes from Herodotus. So we're talking 500 BC. 500 BC is what we're talking about. This is when this is taking place. So Egyptians get stationed in Nubian areas 500 BC, lower than Meroe. We know that he's not talking about sideways because he says that they travel from the Nile down to this region. So, in other words, it's going straight down the line of Ethiopia. Now, this is very valuable information, but he gives us other valuable information, which I've mentioned before, but it's important to bring it up now since we have the context of Arabs or black people living in Arabia. I can show you everything I want. I can show you statues, I can show you the elephants, camels, whatever I want. But until I show you evidence from 500 BC of someone mentioning these people and what they look like, it's pointless. Now, I will mention this. Like I said, I've mentioned it before. So, in this, Herodotus mentions the armies of Xerxes. And if you look at other parts, he mentions people like the Syrometres and the Caspians, the Gandarians, the Azanis. All these people happen to be the Parthians. They happen to be under the power of Xerxes. If we go to the part that is very important, we're talking about this part here that has to do with the Asians and the people stationed in Asia fighting for Egypt. Now consider everything I've said about there were people from Africa living in Asia. Now consider that. Hold that in your mind as I read this. And this is from the time of the ancient Egyptians, 500 BC. The Arabians and the Ethiopians who dwell above Egypt were commanded by Erasmus, son of Darius, and Artistone, daughter of Cyrus, whom Darius loved more than all his wives, and whose image he had made of beaten gold. The Ethiopians from the sunrise were marshaled with the Indians and did not at all differ from the others in appearance. So he's saying that in appearance, in physical appearance, the Ethiopians that were marshaled with the Arabs um, did not differ at all, that were marshaled with the Indians, did not look at all different than the other Ethiopians. So it means in the face, they look the same, these two different types of Ethiopians, but only in their language and their hair. For the eastern Ethiopians are straight haired, but those of Libya have hair more curly than that of any other people. These Ethiopians from Asia were accoutred almost the same as the Indians, but they wore on their heads skins of horses' heads as masks, stripped off with the ears and mane. Now, we have to explain a lot of things here. Libya means Africa. So he says here the, the Ethiopians are straight haired, but those of Libya have hair more curly than that of any other people. So he's saying that the hair of the Ethiopians are very curly, more than anybody else in the world. But those Ethiopians in Asia that look like the Ethiopians in Libya, they happen to have straight hair. And we know this is a fact if we look at the Ethiopians living in Asia. And this is how we know that this is not something that must have happened recently. It must have been some kind of mix between the Asians and the Africans back then for them to have such straight hair. That this is a old fusion. And remember, the Sabaean kingdom at this time would be at least 500 years old. And so we're talking about something that's very, very specific. We're talking about Africans stationed in Asia. And in fact, these ones are stationed a little north of Yemen and Saudi Arabia because he says that they're stationed with the Arabs. Hear that. They're stationed with the Arabs. And of course, you could say, but when he said Eastern Ethiopians, did he mean Indians? Well, I'll tell you why he didn't mean Indians. Because he mentions the Indians. And he says that the Ethiopians, the Eastern or the Asian Ethiopians, are accoutred almost the same as the Indians. Accoutred, by the way, means dressed alike. So he says physically in the face, they look like Africans, but they have straight hair like Ethiopians. They have physically they look like Ethiopians, but they have straight hair like Indians. Now, of course, we could be like, okay, so maybe he's not talking specifically about certain Indians or he's not talking about specifically certain people, but we already know that he is not talking about Ethiopians who are from India straight. How do we know that he's not talking about Indians that are from India straight? Well, if we read in the beginning, it says, the Arabians and the Ethiopians who dwell above Egypt were commanded by Erasmus, son of Darius, and Atrastone, daughter of Cyrus, whom Darius loved more than all his wives, and whose image he had made of beaten gold. The Ethiopians from the sunrise were marshaled with the Indians, and did not at all differ from the others in appearance, but only in their language and their hair. For the eastern Ethiopians are straight haired, but those of Libya have hair more curly than that of any other people. So he's talking about these Ethiopians who dwell above Egypt, the Arabians and Ethiopians who dwell above Egypt. For the other Ethiopians dwell in Libya. Let's move on a little bit and let's think about other things in terms of why are these Ethiopians being compared to Libyan Ethiopians? And also, how could we possibly. Now, before I go back to the standard showing elephants and all these ancient African things, camels moving into Arabia, and we know that camels came from A- um, Ethiopia or the Horn of Africa, and we know that they were in these regions because we see them painted in ancient places in Africa, going all the way to places like Chad. And then we know the genetic history of them are more diverse in that region, which shows geneticists that they started there and they moved into Arabia. But before we go into all of that, let's read two other passages which will be revelatory, which will reveal something to us about why the people in mentioned here, the Ethiopians of Asia, are not Indians. Two verses that show that these Ethiopians are not Indians. Because I know a lot of people are going to be like, well, Ethiopians who have straight hair, Ethiopians who have straight hair, these must be Indians. Now, I'll show you two reasons why this is an unreasonable take. One of them is this: the Ethiopians bordering on Egypt, whom Cambyses subdued when he marched against the Macrobian Ethiopians, and who dwell about the city of Nysa and celebrate festivals of Bacchus, these Ethiopians and their neighbors use the same grain as the Calatian Indians and live in the subterranean dwellings. Both of these bring every third year, and they continue to do so to my time. Two cornices of unmolted gold, 200 blocks of ebony, 5 Ethiopian boys, and 20 large elephant tusks. The Colchians numbered themselves among those who gave presents, as well as the neighboring nations as far as Mount Caucasus. For to this mountain the dominions of Persia extend, but the people to the north side of the Caucasus pay no regard to the Persians. These then for the gifts they imposed on themselves furnished even to my time every 5 years 100 boys and 100 virgins. The Arabians also furnished every year 1,000 talents of frankincense. These then brought to the king the above gifts besides the tribute. The Indians obtained a great quantity of gold, from which they supply the before mentioned dust to the king in the manner presently described. The part of India towards the rising sun is all sand, for the people with whom we are acquainted, and of whom anything certain is told. The Indians live the farthest towards the east and the sunrise of all inhabitants of Asia, for the Indians' country towards the east is a desert by reason of the sand. There are many nations of Indians, and they do not speak the same language as each other. Some of them are nomads and others not. Some inhabit the marshes of the river and feed on raw fish. So we can say, okay, fine. He mentions these Ethiopians again. And remember, when he mentions these Ethiopians, he never mentions them without mentioning that they border on Egypt, which is the first evidence. But here's the second evidence. The second evidence is he mentions other Indians have the following different custom. They neither kill anything that has life, nor sow anything, nor are they wont to have houses, but they live upon herbs, and they have a grain of a size of millet in a pod, which springs spontaneously from the earth. This they gather and boil it and eat it with the pod. When any one of them falls into any disorder, he goes and lies down in the desert, and no one takes any thought about him, whether dead or sick. Okay, now listen to this. Remember, the accusation is from some people that they look like Ethiopians, meaning they have the skin color of Ethiopians, and that's why they call them Ethiopians. But why would Herodotus in the same book say this? And he's talking about Indians here. He says that these Indians, they differ than the other Indians because they differ in customs than any other people, because they eat grain and they would never touch life. This is probably referring to Buddhism. But listen to this. All have the complexion closely resembling the Ethiopians. These Indians are situated very far from the Persians towards the south, and were never subject to Darius. There are other Indians bordering on the city of Caspateris. Okay, so he says there's Indians who are as dark as the Ethiopians, or whose complexion approaches the Ethiopians. So clearly he can tell the difference between dark-skinned Ethiopians and dark-skinned Indians. So when he says Ethiopians the first time, he is not talking about Indians, he's talking about Ethiopians. Now, again, he says that these people were closer to Egypt, and they were moved throughout the kingdom of Persia to the south of Persia, the southern parts of Persia near Nysa, which admittedly Nysa, well, there's three Nysas, but there's one Nysa that is in the Persian regions, very close to India. And he says that they were marshaled with the Indians. So he moved them to this area, and they worked together, these Ethiopians with straight hair, with these Indians, work together to fight. But remember that he says here that the Indians, these Indians, other Indians have the following different custom. These Indians are have a complexion closely resembling the Ethiopians. Not that they are Ethiopians, but that they have a complexion resembling Ethiopians. So now we can look at the images. The first image we should look at is this map showing Macrobians, Ethiopians, Libyans, Atlanteans, Thebans, Sciens, Meroetics. So if you look at the Horn of Africa, you can see Macrobians over there. And it says there, they indeed were not ordered to pay any tribute, but brought gifts. The Ethiopians bordering on Egypt, whom Cambyses subdued when he marched against the Macrobian Ethiopians, and who dwell about the sacred city of Nysa and celebrate festivals of Bacchus. These Ethiopians and their neighbors use the same grain as the Calatian Indians and live subterranean dwellings. Both these bring every third year. Now there's two errors I must fix before I carry on this video. Firstly, when they say Nysa, I said that was in India. Turns out that Nysa, like I said, there was three of them, is associated with Ethiopia. So there's a Nysa in Ethiopia, there's a Nysa in India, and there's a Nysa in Europe. But this Nysa is obviously the one in Ethiopia, not in India. The second thing is above is clearly below for Herodotus. So when he says above, he means south, and when he says below, he means north. We can judge this based on what he said earlier when he says just above elephantine live the Ethiopians. This is a Egyptian classic, but we have to go through it because I just reminded myself of something. The only time that the word curly hair is ever used to describe people in the book of Herodotus. This is the same book, by the way. One book. We're only using one book this whole time. The only time the word curly is used is when they use it to describe the Ethiopians and then the Egyptians. Remember, claims that the Colchians are Egyptians, so there's two groups only. Egyptians and Ethiopians are the only people in the world described with curly hair. Even the Ethiopians living in Asia are described with straight hair. Indians, straight hair. Arabs, straight hair. Europeans, straight hair. Everybody who's got straight hair is described as having straight hair. But the Egyptians are described as swarthy with curly hair when he's comparing them to the Ethiopians. So remember that. Now the question would be, why does he keep saying Ethiopians instead of Egyptian Ethiopians or something like that? Well, the reason is because Egypt is such a landmass on its own that he has to separate it. But to answer this question in a way that's weird, it's the same reason he doesn't call them Arabian Egyptians. He makes a distinction between Arabs and Egyptians and Libyans and Egyptians. So the Egyptians are a standalone group on their own, despite whatever their race is. Even though we have proof, because he says that they're swarthy with curly hair, and he describes almost no other group like that. And I'll even admit that he doesn't even describe the Libyans like that. Well, he does, but different types of Libyans. The Ethiopian Libyans. I don't know if there's any other group of Libyans, but I know that that's how he describes the Ethiopians. Now I want us to revisit these images that resemble the extremities of Asia that borders, or at least the sea borders, Egypt and Arabia. Now let's go back and look at these images. And remember, there are some with elephants, there are some with camels, things typically found in Africa. Not to mention that the people of these places are mixed between Africans and Arabians, and we should not fear or run away from that fact that they were probably mixed with Arab and African, especially since the Arab side probably resembled Sumeria and the African side probably resembled Africa, especially Macrobians, meaning Abyssinians. No point in running away from it. It seems like our trail, even as far back as 500 BC, is detailed in these rock engravings, and that these two primitive civilizations that would jump in species at about 1000 BC and then be seen by people like Herodotus and write them down and say, hey, there's dudes who look like Ethiopians who live just on the other side of the Macrobians, and they live that side of Asia, and they kind of, go to war for the Persians. There it is. There's your answer. Now, again, there is still a debate on who these people are, because remember, back then, people could be mistaken about things, but I want you to be sure that this is probably the most charitable interpretation of this. Herodotus gave us a lot to work with. Don't squander it.